So hi, everybody. My name's Kristen Fletcher. I'm the Programs and Engagement Coordinator here at the Haley Public Library. Tonight, our presentation is Charlie Bemis, The Life and Times of a Chinese American Pioneer with Dr. Priscilla Wegars. We'll first have a PowerPoint, and then at the end of the PowerPoint, we'll take questions and answers. And like I said, please put those in the chat. And then after that, depending on how much time we have, Priscilla brought a number of artifacts from the era of Charlie Bemis, and she'll talk about those, and I think that should be a real extra added attraction. So let me introduce Dr. Priscilla Wegars. She is an author, historian, and historical archaeologist. She received her PhD in history from the University of Idaho in Moscow, where she also founded the Asian American Comparative Collection, which is a unique resource of artifacts, images, and documentary materials. She has written widely about historical Chinese American and Japanese American experiences in the United States, including a children's book about Charlie Bemis, which won honorable mention for Idaho Book in the Year in 2003. In 2017, the Idaho State Historical Society granted her its Esto Perpetua Award, quote, in honor and recognition of significant contributions to the preservation of Idaho history. So a warm, silent welcome, Priscilla. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share your slideshow. You'll want to unmute yourself, and then I know Priscilla made the request that she turn off her video so that instead of looking at her, you can really focus your attention on these wonderful images that she's going to share with us. So I will share that screen. There. So Priscilla,
we're ready. All right, I'm ready. Okay. Hi, everyone, and thanks for attending. And thanks to the Haley Public Library for hosting this presentation today, and especially to Kristen Fletcher for all her help in coordinating everything. Research for the book, Charlie Bemis, The Life and Times of a Chinese American Pioneer, was supported in part by grants from the Idaho Humanities Council and the University of Idaho's John Calhoun Smith Memorial Fund, and I greatly appreciate their support. Although I disagree with some of the information contained in earlier works about Charlie Bemis, I don't mean to disparage or disrespect them in any way. Previous authors have done an invaluable service by bringing her to our attention and exciting our admiration for her. Although I did locate a few sources that were formerly very obscure or even unknown, most of my information was also available to earlier writers. Where we differ is in how we interpret the research materials available to us. So most of you have probably already heard of the Pacific Northwest's most famous Chinese woman, Charlie Bemis, who lived here for over 60 years. After her parents in China sold her, she was smuggled into this country, purchased by a Chinese man, and brought to Warren, Idaho. She and Charlie Bemis married in 1894 and settled on the remote Salmon River. Charlie died in 1922 and Polly died in 1933. Next.
Okay, I'm trying my best to go next, and it is, even though it went next earlier today, it does not seem to be going next now. Let's try this. There we go.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Because I was just trying to see if I could do it from my end.
It's always something, you know?
Yeah, but I'm unfamiliar with this. And so, you know, that's, I don't want to necessarily be doing it all because I'm new at this. Okay. Anyway, somehow a legend arose that Charlie Bemis had won her in a poker game. The strange winnings of Charlie Bemis tells how Bemis, playing with a Chinese opponent, supposedly won Polly, whom another author called the slave girl with the skin like whipping cream, the velvet hair, and the smooth, warm thighs. Next, please. The lack of documentation about Polly's youth in China and her early years in Idaho has led to many other romanticized versions of her life, perpetuating myths about her that are now difficult to dispel. Such fantasies provide few glimpses of Polly's true character and personality and leave readers unable to distinguish the real Polly Bemis from the fictional one. Instead, Polly's actual history is genuinely fascinating, contrasting with the popular perceptions of her that have distorted our understanding of this Chinese woman pioneer. Next. The best known versions of Polly's life are the book and the film, Thousand Pieces of Gold. While they are sympathetic and well-researched portrayals, they unfortunately fictionalize Polly's stories to the extent that readers or viewers cannot distinguish the real events and characters from the invented ones. For example, on the book's title page, author Ruth Ann Lum McCunn describes it as a biographical novel that, quote, tells the story of Polly Bemis. A few fictitious characters have been added and certain events transposed for the sake of the narrative, but the essential story of Polly's life remains accurate, end quote. The title, Thousand Pieces of Gold, is the English translation of a term of endearment used by Chinese fathers to refer to their daughters. Next. A dramatic highlight of both the book and the movie occurs when Charlie Bemis and a Chinese man called Hong King play poker for very high stakes, ownership of Polly herself. Most of the other retellings of Polly's life history also state that Charlie Bemis won her in a poker game, and some even insist that she was once a prostitute. Like many of you, I read the book and saw the movie. Both make Polly's story so intriguing that I believed everything. Next. My first indication that the one in a poker game story might not be accurate was in 1988, when I helped a student find information on the Chinese in Idaho for her term paper. The finished paper included the text of an interview she had with her uncle, Herb McDowell, who grew up in Warren and knew Polly when he was a boy. Mr. McDowell stated emphatically, quote, Polly wasn't won in no poker game, end quote. He told how Polly and Lee Dick, a Chinese physician, nursed Charlie back to health after he was shot. Mr. McDowell commented, they got pretty close, her and Charlie, during this time, and when he got better, they got married just like any other normal people. When the writer asked how McDowell knew this was accurate, he said that Otis Morris had told him, implying that Otis Morris ought to know because he was the stepson of W.J. Kelly, one of the witnesses at the Bemis wedding. Next. It surprised me to learn that Charlie Bemis might not have won Polly in a poker game after all, and I wanted to see if I could learn the truth. But by the time I began investigating, everyone involved had died. In order to separate the truth from myths and legends, I decided to look for what are called primary source materials, meaning that they were written or produced at the time an event occurred. Examples include photographs, census records, newspaper reports, deeds, vital statistics, tax rolls, interviews, letters, and diaries. And this is part of the paper trail that all of us leave behind during our lifetimes. Next. For most of this, the paper trail starts with a birth certificate. For Polly, however, it does not begin until 1880, when that year's United States Census lists her with Charlie Bemis in the town of Washington. Washington and Warrens with an S are both old names for Warren. On this page from the 1880 census, Charlie Bemis and Polly appear together. Charlie's first name, Charles, was abbreviated to Chaz, and Polly has no last name listed. You'll see a close-up of their entry in a minute, but first notice that this one shows what information was gathered at that time. Each set of numbers on the left indicates a different household, so they were living together. The next column is for name, then race, sex, age, marital status, occupation, and place of birth. Next. So here's a close-up of their entry. He's a white male, age 32, and she's a Chinese female, age 27. Subtracting 27 from 1880 gives 1853 as the year of Polly's birth. Although other documents conflict with that date, it's the one she herself used most consistently, and it is on her gravestone. We'll skip the diagonal marks for now and come back to them later. The occupational column states that Charlie ran a saloon and that Polly was housekeeping, probably just keeping house for him and not yet running a boarding house. The last columns show that Charlie was born in Connecticut, as were his parents, while Polly was born in or near Peking, today's Beijing, in northern China. Next. This edition of Thousand Pieces of Gold has 3 photographs on the cover. Because the one at the upper left appears with the other 2, it gives the impression that it too is a photo of her. Next. Since the identical photo is also used inside the book, many people believe that it depicts Polly Bemis as a child with bound feet. Although Polly did once have bound feet, this is not a picture of her then. The author got it from Berkeley's Bancroft Library. A mistaken assumption led to the photograph being redrawn and used as the cover for a booklet about Polly Bemis. Next. This is another illustration from Thousand Pieces of Gold. Again, through no fault of the author, some people have gotten the impression that it is of Polly Bemis herself as a prostitute, but it is not. Next. According to a 1921 interview, Polly's parents sold her as a slave girl because they had no food. An old woman smuggled her into Portland and sold her for $2,500 to an unnamed old Chinese man who took her to Warren in a pack train. People are often disappointed to learn that the handsome young Chinese man, Jim, the love interest in both the book and the movie, was one of Ruth Ann Lum McCunn's fictitious characters. Next. A 1923 newspaper interview with Polly states that she arrived in Warren on July 8, 1872. As she alighted from her horse, she was greeted by a stranger who said, "Here's Polly," as he helped her from the saddle, and ever after, Polly was her name. Although her arrival in Warren would have been an unusual event for that community, I have not yet found it mentioned in a newspaper, a letter, or a diary from that time period. Warren itself never had a newspaper so far as is known, and stories about Warren that appear in other newspapers around that time don't mention it. No original sources name either the Chinese pack train operator who purchased Polly or the Warren Chinese businessman for whom she was intended. While numerous secondary sources state that her Chinese owner's name was Hong King and that he owned a saloon, there is no evidence to show that either statement is true. No Chinese man with that name or that exact occupation appears in any of the documentary sources so far consulted. Next. Although 2 Warren Chinese dealt in retail liquor in 1870 and 1871, their names were Ma Yik Chung and Yi Yik. Idaho's Sister Alfreda Elsenson, who wrote a brief biography of Polly Bemis, used the name Hong King for the Chinese man who owned Polly. However, she herself questioned its existence. In a 1943 letter to her local old-timers, she asked, quote, "Do you know whether there was a Chinese man by that name at Warren's in the early days?" End quote. Next. In order to learn whether any Chinese man in Warren could have afforded to pay $2,500 for a woman, I looked at the 1870 Warren census 2 years before Polly's arrival there. This is a composite page from it. Then the only Chinese man who could have afforded to pay $2,500 for a woman was a 30-year-old placer miner named Ah Young. The word Ah was often used before Chinese first names, so Ah Young meant that person is called Young with no indication of any last name. He had wealth valued at $3,500. The next wealthiest Chinese man, Ah Han, a 35-year-old merchant, had a building and possessions worth only $1,900 in 1870. With Han being his first name and no last name given, he might be the Hong King referred to, but that coincidence is not enough to say that his name was Hong King or that anyone in Warren actually had that name. The person who bought Polly in 1872 may not even be in the 1870 Warren census. Perhaps he came later or was not counted. For example, I know that Charlie Bemis, who later became Polly's husband, lived in Warren by 1870, but for some reason, he is not listed in that year's census. Perhaps he was out of town or mining in a remote area. Next. Polly may have been obliged to work in her owner's business, perhaps as a hostess or dance hall girl. In a later interview, a reporter asked her what she thought of the flapper of today with her rouge and paint, meaning makeup. Polly replied, "I paint like that too all the time till I go to my man. Then I not have to paint anymore. American girl today paint till she gets man too." Next. Let's return to the 1880 census listing Charlie and Polly. Notice the columns with the diagonal marks. If Polly and Charlie were married, they would each have a mark in the middle of the three columns. Instead, a mark in the first one indicates that Charlie Bemis was single, while a similar mark in the third column indicates that Polly was a widow. So how can we explain the fact that Polly is listed as a widow in the 1880 census? In China, wealthy Chinese men often had more than one wife as well as one or more concubines. Such a man coming here without his wife might miss female companionship. In that case, he could buy a woman to be his concubine. He would thus have exclusive use of her services. So a woman in that sort of relationship, while not a wife, was like a wife. Therefore, based on the fact that Polly called herself a widow in the 1880 census, I believe that she was purchased as a concubine. If her owner then died or abandoned Polly to return to China, she would have considered herself a widow. Next. By the summer of 1881, Charlie Bemis ran a saloon and a feed stable in Warren. Even though he and Polly were not married, a newspaper story reported that Mrs. Charles Bemis was one of only 4 women in the entire town. In May 1887, the Bemis' house in Warren burned down. The Idaho County Free Press reported, "The loss is considerable. $500 in greenbacks were consumed and several costly gold watches belonging to various parties and other jewelry worth about $2,000. All the provisions, household furniture, etc. went up in smoke." By early September, Charlie had rebuilt his house. It is the white one on the left, and it may also have served as his saloon. Next. This 1889 tax assessment roll indicates that C.A. Bemis had improvements in Warren valued at $275, probably his house and business, and stock in trade valued at $750, which was probably the liquor for his saloon. Next. Then on September 16, 1890, Charlie was the victim of a shooting affray. His assailant, Johnny Cox, thought Bemis owed him some money, which Bemis refused to pay. Although Cox intended to shoot out Bemis's eye, the ball shattered his cheekbone instead. Next. By the end of October, Charlie was doing well. The Idaho County Free Press editor visited him and found him sitting up and dressed and able to talk and smoke, but looking ghastly with that horrible bullet hole through his face. Although that account did not mention Polly, a 1923 interview credited her with being the person who nursed him back to health after weeks of faithful care. Next. In 1893, a newspaper story said that Warren's population was about 100 Euro-Americans and 75 Chinese men and 1 Chinese woman, who of course was Polly. Charles Bemis, who formerly ran the hotel, then had a private boarding house and also a stable. Polly probably ran the boarding house for him, since in 1924 she said that Jay Cizik was one of her boarders 32 years before, or about 1892. She also told how she silenced the miners who complained about her coffee by appearing with a butcher knife and the question, "Who no like my coffee?" Next. On August 13, 1894, Polly and Charlie were married at Charlie's residence in Warren. Their marriage certificate is now at the Historical Museum at St. Gertrude in Cottonwood, Idaho. Justice of the Peace A.D. Smead performed the ceremony, witnessed by W.J. Kelly and George L. Patterson. Between 1864 and 1887, Idaho had miscegenation laws, making it a misdemeanor for any Euro-American person to intermarry or cohabit with any African American, Native American, or Chinese person. By 1887, the law only prohibited marriages between Euro-Americans and African Americans, so Polly and Charlie had a legal marriage. In 1921, however, in response to Japanese immigration into Idaho, quote, Mongolians, unquote, were added back in as another prohibited group. And that racist law was not repealed until 1959. Next. Even though Polly Bemis was married to an American citizen, United States law did not allow her or any other Asian immigrants to become naturalized until the law was repealed for Chinese people in 1943, 10 years after Polly's death. Under the terms of the renewed Chinese Exclusion Act, Polly Bemis had to apply for a certificate of residence showing that she was legally entitled to live in the United States. Following a court hearing, Judge Beatty ordered that Polly Bemis be granted a certificate of residence. Next. This is the certificate that was issued to Polly on August 10, 1896. The issuing office was in Helena, Montana, and the certificate was probably mailed to her. Next. Soon after Polly and Charlie's marriage in August 1894, they took up a mining claim and moved down to the south side of the Salmon River, about a 17-mile trip from Warren. For the next few years, there's almost nothing known about their lives. Next. In November 1902, however, the Bemises begin to be mentioned in what are known as the Shepp diaries. Charles Shepp, shown here, had a mining claim across the river and several miles away up in the mountains. Shepp wrote daily entries in small pocket diaries. He often came down to purchase produce from the ranch at the mouth of Crooked Creek, across the river from the Bemises. Next. That was a popular Salmon River crossing point. Shepp's first mention of either of the Bemises is on November 8, 1902, when he states, Bemis over this AM. And from then until Polly's death in 1933, his diary entries tell us a great deal about the Bemises. Next. Shepp writes about the Bemises' personal possessions, their garden and what they planted, and their ranch buildings. Like neighbors anywhere, they helped each other out and entertained one another. For example, on November 20, 1902, Shepp records, went over river after dinner, and dinner is always the noon meal. Got parsnips and onions, invited to Thanksgiving dinner the 27th, fine day. January 15, 1903, over the river today, crossed on the ice. Bemis and Polly sick with colds, got jarred tomatoes. Fine day, clear. Next. October 7, 1905, someone down from Warren brought a dog for Polly. April 21, 1906, Robinson back from Concord. He brought word that San Francisco was destroyed by earthquake. Next. February 22, 1908, at Bemis's, fixed sewing machine. This sewing machine head at the Idaho State Historical Museum in Boise came from Polly Bemis's first Salmon River cabin. Next. Besides sewing, Polly enjoyed crocheting and other kinds of needlework. Examples of both are at the Historical Museum at St. Gertrude in Cottonwood and in her restored Salmon River home. Next. April 4, 1908, got bucket eggs from Polly. June 23, 1908, down to river, at Bemis's all night, had strawberries, paid Polly $5.50 for eggs and dried fruit. Although Charlie Bemis didn't have an income, Polly had some money saved from when she worked in Warren, and she made additional money from selling fruit, vegetables, and eggs. Next. February 6, 1910, took picture of Polly and Nellie and Julie. Nellie and Julie were the horses. Next. In 1910, Shepp purchased the ranch at the mouth of Crooked Creek, and he and his mining partner, Peter Klinkhammer, began living there. They and the Bemises often visited back and forth. Next. August 17, 1910, Polly and Bemis over to dinner. Polly caught 27 fish. In later years, Pete Klinkhammer commented, Polly loved to fish and was good at it. We'd see her gardening and she'd bend to the earth real quick, then shove something into the big pocket of her long dress. Come 3 o'clock every day, Polly had her gardening done and her fish bait ready and waiting in her pocket. We used to know what time it was by watching her. Next. August 17, 1910, Bear been eating Bemis's apples. Had watermelon at Bemis's. Fine day. July 18, 1911, Pete back this afternoon. Got capped for Polly. Next. Occasionally there's unintended humor in the diaries. One sequence starts on January 7, 1912. Put George in chicken house. On January 8, Shepp killed George. He weighed 4 pounds. Then on Sunday, January 21, Shepp wrote, Bemis and Polly over to dinner. Cooked George with noodles. Next. November 6, 1912. I came home, brought down shoes for Polly. And these shoes were found in the cabin after she died. Earlier on April 29, 1912, Shepp wrote, mail from Nellie, his sister. First heard of the loss of the Titanic by hitting an iceberg. Next. August 14, 1914. Pete back this evening, got phonograph and records. And this is a list of some of Shepp's records. Pete Klinkhammer recalled that one record concerned a Chinese laundryman and Uncle Josh's troubles invariably made Polly chuckle. Next. September 6, 1915, over river this evening, sent to Montgomery Ward for shoes for Polly and got her order for grub. August 11, 1919, over river, fixed telephone. Shepp had installed a battery-operated telephone between their two places and later ran the line on his side up over the mountain to town. Next. September 6, 1919, boat down with 9 men. They stopped here tonight. Captain Harry Gulicki, shown here, piloted the boat. Passenger Will Shoup said, another interesting character was Charles Bemis, who has lived with a Chinese wife on a little 4-acre patch of land on Polly Creek for the past 25 years, meaning since 1894. He is getting too old to work and Polly, the wife, does it all. Next. On Polly's birthday, September 11, 1920, Shepp wrote, over river to dinner. Polly, 67 years old. China Sam at Bemis's tonight. Fine day. Subtracting 67 from 1920 gives 1853 as the year of Polly's birth. Again, the Euro-Americans called this man China Sam, but his real name was Zheng Chu. He ran a bathhouse in Warren and was one of Polly's friends from when she lived there. Next. On July 21, 1921, Shepp wrote, boat down this evening. On this trip, again captained by Harry Gulicki, one of the passengers was Sissy Patterson, also known as Countess Eleanor Geisica. In 1923, an account of her visit with Polly Bemis appeared in the magazine Field and Stream. It is the first known interview with Polly. Next. The Countess wrote, Polly stands not much over 4 feet, neat as a pin, wrinkled as a walnut, and at 67, she is full of dash and charm. Polly told the Countess, I cost $2,500, don't look it now, and chuckled. The Countess asked Polly where Mr. Bemis was, and she said, abed. He been abed most 2 year now. When Polly indicated that Charlie was pretty cross and implied that she had to wait on him a lot, the Countess suggested that maybe Polly should get another husband. He, she laughed. Yes, I think so too. Next. With Charlie Bemis bedridden, Charlie Shepp and Pete Klinkhammer increasingly took over many of the Bemis's chores. During 1921, for example, Shepp wrote that they crossed the river many times to cut wood for the Bemises, put out a stovepipe fire, plow and plant their garden, burn brush, cut hay, and do the watering. Next. Captain Gulicki's trips almost always stopped so his passengers could visit with Polly and take photos. This is the July 1922 R.E. Shepherd party from Twin Falls. Captain Gulicki is on the left and Polly, then 68 years old, is in front. One of the men on the trip kept a diary. His entry for Wednesday, July 19, 1922 reads, quote, "About 5 p.m. we stopped at Polly Bemis's place. Bemis is an old timer here, probably 75 years old and confined to his bed. His wife, Polly, is a Chinese woman. She looks after him and tends to the garden, orchard, and farming operations. Polly has been in the Salmon River country for more than 40 years and has never been off the ranch for 28 years, end quote. Next. Then less than a month later, on August 16, 1922, with Pete away taking produce to Dixie, Shepp wrote that the Bemis's house burned at 12 noon. Had a hell of a time. Got the old man out by the skin of my teeth. Lost Teddy, that was Polly's dog. He got burned. Polly and I got the old man over the river about 4. Had hard time. Didn't save a single thing. The whole place was on fire when I got over." In a 1924 interview, Polly said that she lost one of her most cherished possessions, a blue silk dress about 35 years old with rows of buttons made by her husband from $2.50 and $5 gold pieces. The silk was sent into the camp from San Francisco and was lined with flour sacks from Grangeville. Although the dress burned, Polly later recovered the buttons. Next. On October 29, Charlie Bemis died. Shepp wrote in the margin, "Bemis dead," and underlined it for emphasis. Bemis passed in at 3 a.m., up to camp, left at 5, and up to camp was a mining camp in the mountains. Left at 5 a.m., Gus and Holmes down. We buried the old man right after dinner, fine day. Next. This is Charlie Bemis's grave at the Shepp Ranch. Since Polly surely helped choose his final resting place, it is not surprising to find that it is in a nearly ideal setting with respect to the Chinese principles of feng shui. Next. There, the ideal location for a grave is in the center of a south-facing slope overlooking a body of water, preferably a meandering stream or river. A curving south-facing hillside embraces Charlie Bemis's grave, which would still face the river if modern buildings did not intervene. Next. On October 31, Shepp wrote, "Polly going to Warren." She went up with Pete the next day and would live there for nearly 2 years. While she was there, Shepp wrote to her occasionally. Although Polly could not read or write, she had many friends in Warren who surely read the letters to her and who probably wrote down replies that she dictated. Pete Klinkhammer later said, "Bemis started to teach her to read once, but she got along too well and he quit. It wouldn't have taken her very long if he'd been willing to put out the effort." Next. In July 1923, Charlie Shepp's sister Nellie and brother Harvey came for a long visit. When they left in August, they went back through Warren. There, a car took them and Polly to Grangeville. Nellie and Polly had their photograph taken along the way. Next. In Grangeville, the Idaho County Free Press interviewed Polly. Described as a little old gray-haired woman weighing less than 100 pounds, Polly wore boys' shoes on her tiny feet, bound in childhood, and wore a plain cotton dress. Polly had many callers during the week at the home of Mrs. Anson Holmes, where she is a guest. She came here from Warren by automobile in order to be fitted with glasses, and she also had some dental work done. Polly took her first automobile ride and saw her first train, but her first motion picture fascinated her the most. Next. After a week in Grangeville, Polly returned to Warren on the Salmon River stage. "I have best time in 50 years, she exclaimed. "Maybe I come back next year." Bedecked in a new dress, a gay hat, and white shoes, Polly was particularly proud of her new gold-rimmed spectacles. Next. Shepp and Klinkhammer agreed to build Polly a new house and look after her. In exchange, they would get the ranch on her death. Between October 1923 and May 1924, Shepp often wrote about sawing the house logs, putting them up, cutting shakes for the roof, putting in a new telephone, installing flooring, and constructing windows. Next. In the meantime, Polly kept busy in Warren. She was always very fond of children and reportedly knew the name of every child born in Warren and the date of its birth. Johnny Carey was a very special young friend. He grew up to write several books, one of which was River of No Return with Court Conley. Next. Johnny, his parents, Tom and Jeannie, and his two sisters, Gay and Mary, lived on the South Fork of the Salmon River. In order to go to school, the children had to live in Warren, away from home. Johnny stayed at a hotel, but when his next younger sister, Gay, started school, she lived with Polly that term. Johnny helped Polly with chores, such as bringing in wood. Next. In August 1924, Polly visited Boise. She went with Jay Sizik and his wife, and they stayed at the Idaho Hotel. Sizik ate in my boarding house 32 years ago. I know him long time, she said. In Boise, Polly saw her first streetcar, her first high building, her second movie show, and rode in her first elevator, all in one day. A reporter interviewed her at the Idaho Hotel. Polly, at 70, was then a tiny woman with iron gray hair, the brightest of eyes, dressed in a blue cotton dress, her whole appearance scrupulously neat. Her speech is excellent, with just enough of the pidgin English to make it fascinating. Her memory is remarkable, particularly for dates, and her eyes twinkle as she tells jokes on herself. Next. After Polly returned to Warren, construction activities increased on her Salmon River house. By September 1924, Charlie Shepp was over there nearly every day working on it. On October 8, Pete went to Warren, and on the 9th, he came back with Polly. She stayed with them across the river for just over a week until they finished and finally moved in on Friday, October 17, 1924. This is the interior of her restored cabin, but only a few of the things were actually hers. Next. Charlie Shepp built a bed for Polly as well as a table and chairs, and Pete cut firewood for her. As she became older, Shepp and Klinkhammer did more and more of the heavy work. Polly still kept very busy. In one 2-week period during 1926, she killed 4 porcupines. We'll just have to imagine how she did it, since the diary doesn't detail her method. Next. Despite being unable to read or write, Polly sometimes got mail. It waited at the nearest post office for Pete Klinkhammer to collect when he took produce into town to sell. Next. In later years, a friend asked Pete if Polly could read. Pete replied, "Could Polly read? Money and 15 too. She was a sharp gambler in a cribbage game and used to pit her wits against the best of them. 2 fellows once came and camped across Crooked Creek and did some placer mining over there. One of them liked to make a big show. He used to get vegetables and a few little things from Polly. She never charged for the stuff, but he kept flashing this $100 bill to show off, I think. Well, Polly let it pass a few times. Then one day she got tired of this and she surprised him. 2 things Polly could do good: count money and 15 too. She changed it for him. After that, he didn't flash no more money." Next. Then on Friday, August 4, 1933, Shepp went across the river in the morning and found Polly laying outside. She is bughouse, meaning insane, and nearly helpless. Shepp managed to get Polly across the river and cared for her in his home. 2 days later, Pete and a friend took her halfway out on horseback, where they met a car sent from Grangeville to get her. The following Friday, Shepp learned that Polly was getting along fine, and she probably had had a stroke. Next. Through all the Shepp diaries, in the newspaper stories, and in the interviews with Polly herself, there is absolutely no mention of Polly being won in a poker game. One of the first published references to it occurred in 1933 when she was in the Grangeville Hospital. A newspaper account related that Cizik explodes myth of Chinese poker bride, suggesting instead that an Indian girl named Molly was the real poker bride. Next. On November 5, 1933, reporter Lamont Johnson, writing for the Sunday Oregonian, published a lengthy article with sensational headlines. Old China woman of Idaho famous, Polly Bemis, seriously ill in Grangeville Hospital, career nearly ended. Patient denies that she was won in poker game by man who later married her. Next. On November 6, 1933, Polly Bemis died in the Grangeville Hospital. She was just over 80 years old. Her death certificate lists cause of death as chronic myocarditis, which is defined as the inflammation of the muscular part or myocardium of the heart wall. Next. Polly passed away this afternoon. Shepp underlined this entry to emphasize its importance. Polly was buried 2 days later. Neither Shepp nor Klinkhammer could attend, and instead, Shepp wrote that he got one deer today, pretty big. Over the next few weeks, Shepp crossed the river to get things, sugar, flour, and even a bed, presumably the one he had made for Polly. He also fed her cat, Johnny. By January 1934, he no longer saw Johnny across the river, and in February he wrote, "Over river PM, I guess Johnny is gone." Next. There's an unsolved puzzle with regard to Polly Bemis. She's often called La Lu, but where did that name come from? It does not appear in any of the newspaper accounts, in the interviews with Polly, or in the Shepp diaries. Its earliest occurrence seems to be in 1947 in volume 1 of Sister Alfreda Elsonson's Pioneer Days in Idaho County. Next. There she states, quote, "As previously indicated in the certificate of marriage, her Chinese name was La Lu Nathoy," end quote. So here is that certificate again, but as you can see, the name La Lu is not mentioned. I've not yet learned where Sister Alfreda found the name La Lu. Even the surname Nathoy is questionable. This letter could be an N or an H. It does not appear anywhere else in the document. Next. In fact, when Polly's marriage was recorded at the Idaho County Courthouse in 1894, the recorder copied her surname as Hathoy with an H. Since neither Nathoy nor Hathoy is a Chinese name, this word may be an approximation of the Chinese name Ah Toy. Next. Over the years until his death in 1970, Pete Klinkhammer gave many of Polly's personal possessions to the Historical Museum at St. Gertrude in Cottonwood in care of Sister Alfreda Elsonson. Next. In June 1987, Polly's restored home on the Salmon River was dedicated as a museum. Her remains were removed from Grangeville's Prairie View Cemetery and reburied adjacent to her restored home. So she is across the river from her husband, who is still buried at the Shepp Ranch. Her tombstone reads, Polly Bemis, September 11, 1853 to November 6, 1933. Because Euro-American people selected her gravesite, it lacks the feng shui characteristics of her husband's. Therefore, ironically, Charlie's gravesite is more typically Chinese than Polly's is. Next. I hope I have persuaded you to be more skeptical of some of the supposed facts about Polly Bemis's life, particularly the one in a poker game legend, the name Hong King for Polly's owner, and even the name La Lu for Polly. Next. Finally, people often ask me what makes Polly Bemis so famous. I think it is because she represents all the forgotten Chinese women who came to the United States during the late 19th century. Women who arrived often unwillingly, without knowing English, and with no prospect of ever returning home. While here, these women faced racial prejudice from Euro-American people and sexual discrimination from Chinese men. Polly Bemis lived in Idaho for over 60 years. During that time, her strength of character enabled her to rise above adversity, winning respect and admiration from everyone who knew her. Despite the ambiguities and contradictions about Polly's life that still remain, there is one thread that joins all the sources together. In one way or another, they have all said Polly was a wonderful person and everybody loved her. Next. For several years, I led a University of Idaho enrichment and summer school class up the Salmon River by jet boat to visit Polly's home and the two graves, where we tried to recapture the spirit of this remarkable pioneer woman. Perhaps someday you too can join me, going up the river of no return, back into the past. Next. Thank you, and thank you for letting us into your homes.
Well, that was just wonderful. And I apologize that I forgot to mute myself, so I hope you didn't hear
Oh,
too much background noise from me. But uh, you know, Priscilla,
mm,
one of the things that I
mm.
enjoy, I've heard your presentation twice now,
Oh,
and
yeah.
one of the things that I have so enjoyed about it is not only learning about this remarkable person who I'd
Mm,
heard of.
mm.
I lived in Salmon, been downriver and
All
all,
right, yeah.
haven't been to her home. Um, but just that sort of thrill of discovery that a historical archaeologist goes through trying to, you're a detective,
Just about.
trying to sleuth out the details and all the primary and secondary sources that you try to track down. And it's just wonderful. So we do have a question. Again, I encourage you all to click on the chat and type in a question or comment if you'd like. So Priscilla, did you ever meet the boy, later a man, who Polly cared for in his schoolboy years?
I think the person must mean Johnny Carey, who lived with Polly for a school term. And yes, I did. He was quite elderly and he had had a stroke. So I communicated with him mainly through his wife, Pearl. And I would send written questions, and then Pearl, on good days, Pearl would ask Johnny, and then she would send me the replies. And I did get to meet him in person several times as well. And I in the book, there's quite a lot of information that I got, and mainly it was, just asking the right question to get a yes or no answer. He could not go into detail, and but I could get yes or no answers, and then a lot of that made its way into the book, and I was very, very grateful. In fact, the book is dedicated, one of the people it was dedicated was to Johnny Carey. At least the children's book was dedicated to him.
Hmm. Thank you. Lauren comments that her boyfriend Josh and she visited Polly's cabin just this last
Oh,
summer, on
wow,
a
lucky.
rafting trip. It's really great to see this presentation, and she thanks you too.
Oh, thank you.
Um, and then Wendy asks, do you have any idea how she got the name Polly?
It's really curious. Euro-American people claim that they could not pronounce Chinese names. And so they would give Chinese women and men names that they knew and could pronounce. And so some of the typical names for Chinese women were Molly, Jenny, things like this. But, if Polly's name had been La Lu, that's not so different from Lulu, which was a not a very common name, but reasonably common at that time. And so why they wouldn't have called her Lulu, why Polly? But Polly was, again, it was a common name for Chinese women, and they just said, here's Polly. And I don't know who, settled on that name, but she seemed to be happy with it, and just, was happy to be called Polly for the rest of her life.
Hmm. I'm curious, for those of you who are on this on this Zoom, how many of you have seen or visited Polly's cabin? If you have a chance to put that in the chat, I'd just be really curious. Let's see, we have another question for you. What do you credit for Polly's incredible strength? Chinese, a woman. She was quite petite, but really what a force and what a strong and determined life she lived. I mean, she made a life in a real life in a really difficult
Hmm.
situation. So what would you what from what you've learned, why how do you think she got that incredible strength?
Well, I mean, for people that believe in Chinese astrology, Polly was an ox. She was born in the year of an ox, and you know that the ox are they're very dependable, steadfast, and just working hard workers, and so on. But I think that she just had a strength of character that many other people don't have, and it just she. You know, you say, well, when life hands you lemons, make lemonade, and that's certainly what Polly did. I mean, she adapted to her circumstances. She made a life for herself in this country. She knew she would never be going back to China. She may have wanted to, but then that wasn't going to be possible. And so she was forward looking and just adapted to her circumstances. I mean, I think we can all learn from her. And just, sometimes people, you just think that maybe this is, here you're in a bad situation or something, and you just, you feel so depressed, and but she must have been in situations like that herself, and she just, she overcame it. Honestly, she just, she persevered.
Mhm. Kathy said that she hasn't visited Polly's home yet, but would like to. And then Tom asks, "Was Polly a contemporary of Buckskin Bill?" And maybe you could tell us who Buckskin Bill is or was.
Oh, well, if I'd had time to practice this, I could, if I had Court's book handy, I could tell you a lot about Buckskin Bill. But he was a character who lived on the Salmon River, a few miles upriver from Polly's. But he was much more, no, I don't. I'm pretty sure they were not contemporary. She died in 1933, and he came along a bit later. But there are several accounts of his. One would be in Court Conley's book. I think it was called Idaho Loners. Loners, and I'm pretty sure Buckskin Bill is in there, and he's in other. And I bet if you Googled him, you'd find out some information. I'm sorry I can't be more precise, but I don't think he was a contemporary of Polly's.
So, having lived in Salmon for 3 years, I know that there are a lot of, you might call them individuals or real characters that live along the Salmon River. And the Salmon River, it's the river of no return. It's got incredibly steep sides much of the way down. And yet there are these fertile alluvial fans that come
Mhm.
out along the creek. So you've got fertile soil and you've got fresh water right there,
Mhm.
plus fishing, like you mentioned. But first of all, I guess, why do you think there are those characters living there? And then do you know why Charlie Bemis chose that particular piece of land, or why he decided to move there?
I I surmise that it was because of the difficulties of being a Euro-American man married to a Chinese woman. Although it was not illegal at that time, there was a lot of prejudice against that sort of thing, and there was always the possibility that despite having a certificate of residence, something could happen that would cause Polly to be deported. And when they were down there, they were just where nobody could really get them, and they were just out of touch with anyone that might want to come and do that sort of thing. So I think they just wanted to just get out of civilization and go down there where they make a life for themselves and not be bothered by anybody.
Mhm. I was a little surprised as you told the story that when she went to, I forget now whether it was Warren or someplace Grangeville maybe, to get classes, and later when she was sick, how warmly welcomed she was. Like she was famous or well known, or
Mhm.
how did that? I mean, if she so seldom went to larger towns, how did people
Mhm.
even know about her? Um,
Well, in a way, she was. Polly had a lot of, I'm going to put this in air quotes, Polly had a lot of novelty value. She was unusual in being a Chinese woman, and there were very few Chinese women around, and mostly they were kept in seclusion. So, but so people were curious about her. They were interested in her. They were nosy. And it wasn't, I mean, a Chinese man, because of the prejudice at that time, you would never invite a Chinese man into your home or to spend the night, whatever. But Polly was different, and people wanted to get to know her. She was friendly and she was helpful, and she was somebody that everyone wanted to know. When they didn't know her, they liked her, they could only speak highly of her. And she was a celebrity. And I think one of the things could be, a lot of, there wasn't, of course, the television, radio, all this other stuff that we have now. People subscribe to newspapers and magazines. And so when they're subscribing to Field, and many people subscribe to Field and Stream, she's in Field and Stream and interviewed, and so on. And so, her fame spread. And so if it's like today, if if you know a famous person, boy, you want to be, chatting with that person, invite them to your home if they'll come, and this kind of thing. And so she was, in that kind of situation.
Thank you. Let me look at questions. Anne says that she's been to her home and property on a river trip down the
Mm,
Salmon River, and what a treat it was. Karen says, I was able to stay at the property almost 2 years ago
okay.
as I hiked the property and as I hiked the property and toured her rebuilt cabin. It was truly amazing. Who manages that property now?
Oh, well, it's a timeshare, and it's now the Polly Bemis Ranch. And you can buy shares in this, and that entitles you to stay, I think, for about 14. I don't know if there's anybody on this in the chat that would know, who's a member of this, but you can stay there for like 14 days. They've built cabins, they have a nice lodge and things like this. And in fact, I'm going to finally get that opportunity at the end, I hope, at the end of April, when a graduate student at the University of Idaho is doing an excavation there. And so several of us will go, and we'll be able to stay in the cabins for a week and then work on the archaeological excavation. So I'm really looking forward to that. I did look into the possibility of buying a timeshare for the University of Idaho's Asian American Comparative Collection. And my idea was to take 14, instead of getting 14 nights for one person, taking 14 students for one night. And that was, the board and of the timeshare didn't think that was such a great idea. So that kind of fell by the wayside. But I'm hoping maybe another time that might be possible.
Well, great. Here we go. Where do you do most of your research? Is it gathered in one place?
Well, a lot of this was done before many things became available, like on, Google and this kind of thing, before stuff was scanned. And so newspapers came from the University of Idaho Library Special Collections, microfilm, and they also had copies of Charlie Shepp's diaries, and I was allowed to make photocopies of them and then comb through them page by page. And you saw that writing, some of it was difficult to read. Comb through them looking for mentions of Polly and Charlie Bemis. And really, it's just a lot of little things, kind of putting it all together to make into a bigger story.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat, but I know you have some
Mm,
artifacts from
okay,
Polly's era.
right.
So what I'd suggest to everybody is, if you take your cursor to the upper right hand corner of your screen, um, you'll see an option for view, and pick speaker view, and that will let whoever's speaking be the primary person, and you'll be able to see Priscilla's the artifacts that she's brought with her.
So, all right, well, I'm showing one now. I don't see myself, but do you see me? Am I the biggest person on your screen now?
Yes.
I am. Okay, on yours. All right.
And
So,
and Priscilla, talk just a little bit more quietly, because for some reason or other, your microphone is picking up your voice very, very well.
okay. All right. I'll try to speak more softly and correct me, if you want to. All right. Now, mind you, none of these objects were owned by Polly Bemis. They are all made in China and either brought here by Chinese people or imported by Chinese merchants and sold in Chinese stores. They are in the University of Idaho's Asian American Comparative Collection. They were not excavated. Most of them have been purchased with funds donated to us for this reason. And the Asian American Comparative Collection, we like to have the whole example. So when we have an archaeological excavation that only finds the bits and pieces, and you can see this one or some other ones are broken, then we can identify what they are. So this jar, which we call a spouted jar, it probably contained soy sauce. Oops. This is what we call a liquor bottle, and it held people call it rice wine, but it's not a wine because it was distilled, not fermented. And the Chinese didn't use this liquor to become intoxicated. They used it more as a tonic, because you can see that the cup that they used for it is very tiny. This was a jar for preserved or pickled vegetables. Now, and it had a lid that was like just sat on the top of it, like so. Now, what is particularly interesting about this one is we know that Polly had one at her Salmon River place because she used it for her sourdough starter. It was not the same one, but it was one like it. And I think that one is now in the Idaho State Museum in Boise. Okay, so and this is a serving bowl, and it has the flowers of the 4 seasons on it. So there's the winter flowering plum, and then there's peonies and a lotus and a chrysanthemum for the different seasons. And so basically what would happen in a Chinese, like maybe like a mining, a group of miners together, is that they'd have a cook, and then the food would be put into this like a communal bowl, and then the miners or the individuals would help themselves, and each person would have their individual rice bowl. And so they would put that into this, and they would also use this bowl for soup with a ceramic soup spoon. You can see these often in Chinese restaurants, the spoons, but they're plastic now instead of ceramic. And there would be, of course, they would a pair of chopsticks, and then a teacup. And I'll just put that together with and here's another little liquor cup. I'll hold those up so you can see how really tiny the liquor cup is compared to the teacup. And then there would be a sauce dish where you would put your like soy sauce or whatever into that, and then use your chopsticks then to dip your food from your bowl into the sauce dish. Then a few other small things. Of course, on Chinese sites, we often find Chinese coins, circular with a square hole in them. And
Quick
we
question,
also, sure.
Priscilla, just a quick question on that. Is that real money? That
Yes, absolutely. But
it was, okay.
but it was not used as money in this country, pretty much. They used American money, but it had other uses. It had medicinal uses. In other words, you could scrape your skin with it. You could put it in water, boil it, and drink the water. But as far as we know, they didn't use it as money in this country.
Thank you.
Yeah. One thing that's very common on Chinese sites are these are medicine bottles. And they had one, I'm trying to hold it so it can be seen. There we go.
They're perfect.
Yeah. And it had a single dose of pills, powder, liquid, or oil. And people who don't know what these are and who know that some of the Chinese used opium, they've called these opium bottles. But these bottles could never have contained opium, and I'll get to that in a minute. We know from bottles that did have labels, as are sometimes seen in museums, and this one has little pills in it that are like radish. They look like radish seeds almost, and it has a red label on it. Okay, and so the label tells us what the pills were generally for. So when we look at this as another just example of a medicine bottle, and so if the opium didn't come in that, how did it come? Well, it came in cans like this. And it was gummy, kind of like road tar on a hot day, so that you would need an implement to get it out. And usually these cans were Chinese people could not import opium into the United States. It was only able to be imported by Euro-American merchants. And so here is a label from one of these. The government taxed it just like we tax cigarettes and alcohol today. And then some of the information that is on here is Siberia is the name of the vessel, the ship. Playfair is the name of the Euro-American importer. Okay. And 5 taels was the Chinese weight of it, which was a few ounces, as you can see from this. So this is about the size of kind of a big spice can. Then the top of it had, if I can turn it so you can see, there's a cartouche there with characters in it, and that usually meant the brand name. And I don't know if you can see on here, if you can see cross hatching in the metal. Can you see crisscross marks? That is an indication that this was legally imported because the customs people used a metal tool to cross out the customs label that had been pasted onto it. So the government was making money at this, and it was not until 1909 that it was outlawed by the US government. Before that, certain communities did outlaw it by local ordinance. And the reason they did it was pretty much like in the Chinese communities, maybe a third of people smoked it, and not all the time. I mean, they had to work, but it helped if you didn't have enough to eat. It helped, with the hunger pangs, and which some of us may be feeling right at this moment, I'm not sure. And it helped with that, and it helped you, work harder and not be so tired. But you couldn't do that. It was more like, in our culture, it was more like happy hour, maybe like Friday afternoon, well, they work Fridays, but and Saturdays. So maybe Saturday at evening, they might do it once a week, not to excess, or they would, it is very, very addictive. And so they had to be very careful. And then finally, I just wanted to show you a few things. We don't have, because there were so few women, we don't get many things related to women from archaeological sites or even available to purchase, but I wanted to show you just a couple things, 3 things. This tiny little bottle has a label. It's another medicine bottle. And it's called, the characters have been translated, and it is eye medicine for old ladies. Okay. And then this is a Chinese woman's earring, and there is no, it just has a metal prong that would fit through a hole in your ear. There's nothing that would go on the back of it or anything. It just sits, sort of fits through your ear. And so I'm sure that's why that one was lost. But I don't know if you could see the decoration on this, which is, flowers and so on carved on there. And then the final thing to show you, I know we talked about foot binding, and foot binding was done in China for many, many years, and it was only outlawed early in the 20th century. But the idea was to compress the foot, break the bones, fold the toes under, so that sort of you had the big toe and the heel that your foot would rest on, and your arch was broken. And so the foot would then fit into a very tiny pair of shoes. These are maybe 4 inches long. And we know that, I mean, it sounds horrible to us, but it was the fashion. And you think about American women today, that they're wearing stiletto heels and very pointed toes, and you can hardly walk with that. And I have a Kathy cartoon in the book that it speaks to exactly that point. So anyway, those are the few things that I had to show. And if anyone has any questions about those, or more questions about Polly, I'm happy to try to answer them.
One question was posted. Linda asked, what did Charlie do on the river? Was he a prospector and miner? I know one of those pictures you showed showed an enormous garden at their ranch. I mean, it must be at least a half an acre in size, but was he a miner?
He moved down there primarily to mine, and that's be how he made money. But they also raised a big garden, which Polly did a lot of it, and Charlie did, of course, he did too, while he was able. But and we don't really know what their life was like from 1894 until like 1902, when there's a period of time in there when he had to be taking produce up to Warren to sell it and things like that, for them to make money to buy the things that they could not make or grow. And so I'm sure he was, I mean, he just sort of, he never came out as being seen as someone who liked to work very hard. But I think towards the end of his life, he was ill, and we think he had tuberculosis, but not sure what it was that would keep him bedridden. But just because Polly and Pete Klinkhammer and Charlie Shepp were such prodigious workers that Charlie Bemis looked pretty poor in comparison. But I think, I think he did what he could, and especially in later years, we get the impression that he was lazy. And well, I mean, maybe he was, but I mean, he had to have been working hard to keep that garden going for as long as he could. So, yeah.
So let's see. Cindy says, thank you so much. There are 4 of us watching your presentation. Very interesting and informative. Wendy says, or she asks, would the artifacts be brought with immigrants from China, or could they be purchased in San Francisco or elsewhere?
Both. And none of these things that you saw were manufactured here. So the people either brought it with them, or they bought it from Chinese stores. And I mean, even places like Moscow, Idaho, where I live, we had Chinese stores. Warren had Chinese stores. Every little place had a little Chinese store where there was a population of Chinese, and they also served the Euro-American community to some cases. So yes, all that stuff was imported from China.
Great, thank you. So we have just several other people saying, thanks so much, really wonderful presentation. Cassie says, appreciate all your research. So,
thank you, thank you.
So I'm going to go down to, because we're just coming to the end, I'm going to go down to reactions and give you a big handshake there, Priscilla,
Mm,
or hand clap. Thank you so much for such an informative presentation. I feel like we all learned a lot about China, Chinese culture, um, just the times of women back in the late 1800s, and a lot about northern Idaho mining camps, and all kind of distilled from the life story of Polly Bemis. So on behalf of everyone here in the Haley Public Library, thank you very, very much for
mm.
sharing your enthusiasm and knowledge.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you. Thanks for coming.